Hello everyone, and welcome to our Universal Peace Federation program today. My name is Ray LaPalkin, and at the Universal Peace Federation we're promoting interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values. So if those resonate with you, please get in touch with us. Our program today is titled China's Deeper Strategic Moves, and we're going to be looking at some highlights from a webinar that we recently held. And we're trying to look at what China has been doing around the world, and they've been doing it somewhat inconspicuously. And when we talk about China and Russia and some of the communist nations, of course, we really feel that it's somewhat of a challenge to free democracy around the world. And I like to mention that it's not the people that we're challenging, it's the ideology of communism. So if we look at the countries, for instance, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, and other smaller, perhaps communist leading countries in the world, we can just see how, in a sense, backwards some of them are. They haven't really been able to develop economically simply because of the communist ideology and more of a dictatorship, where there's lacking of free democracy, a free press, a free expression. So this is what we're trying to expose. And today we're going to be talking about China. And I'd like to read a little bit that kind of highlights the program today. China has for decades, been creating a global network of ports and bases from the Panama Canal throughout South Asia, Africa, and beyond. For the most part, the world has either yawned, failed to notice or assist, and to be fair, there's a few opinion leaders in policy and media that have been trying to get the world's attention as China developed its Global Belt and Road Initiative and has been expanding their military capabilities at a rate that goes far beyond the needs of a country to just defend itself. Democracy has been crushed in Hong Kong, and there are daily provocations into Taiwan's airspace. So today we're going to take a little look at what China has been doing, and some of it you may already know about. Some of it has been somewhat kept secret, and we're just trying to expose and make the public aware of China's global interests. So let's watch this video. Thank you so much.
The next speaker is Mr. Bill Gertz. He's a national security correspondent for the Washington Times, as well as the editor and publisher of the news site Flash Critic Cyber Threat News. He's author of 8 books. The one that I'm reading right now is called Deceiving the Sky. This is an excellent book. It's really like a very in-depth textbook to study each area of the China's development, from cyber threats to the whole challenge of diplomacy and propaganda and Huawei and all of it. It's just fascinating and also shocking. What's really shocking about his book is the way that the American leadership from various parts of our society has always believed, some of them believe very strongly, that if China really developed their prosperity, they would leave communism behind. Well, Bill will help shed some light on that. On January 4th, he wrote a very powerful article for the Washington Times. He writes every day, and this was on China and the Xi Jinping's message during the anniversary of the Chinese history. So I'd like to invite at this time Mr. Bill Gertz. Bill, welcome.
Great, thank you, Michael, for that kind introduction. I'm going to very briefly go over what I call China's expansionism. But before I do that, I want to provide a little bit of background on how we got to the situation where we now see China's drive for global dominance and global supremacy. I've been covering the Pentagon since 1985 for the Washington Times, and I covered back then the publications known as Soviet military power, an annual assessment of the threat posed by the Soviet Union. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Pentagon then began publishing something called the China Military Power Report. But it was much different. It was always a bone of contention among policy and intelligence officials over how to characterize communist China. And I can remember in those early reports, which were done primarily by the Defense Intelligence Agency, but massaged heavily by the policy community, both in the Pentagon and outside. And I can remember the Pentagon saying that China had no military ambitions beyond reaching out and retaking Taiwan. In other words, it was not a global threat. This turned out to be a huge, huge failure. And the reason for that is because of a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature and the character of the communist regime in China, in Beijing. And it's beginning to be realized now, more than 20, 30 years later, that China poses the most serious existential threat. And yet we still are debating over whether China is a threat. And I can tell you that the problem is a misunderstanding of the nature of the communist system. If you talk to people who lived in China under the communist regime, or lived in Russia or Eastern Europe under those communist systems there, they're very clear. They have a very clear understanding of what communism is, how it works, and its ideological motivations. Yet we in the West have really failed to capture this. I can remember so many times the intelligence community and the policy community insisting publicly that China posed no threat to the United States or to the West. Now we see that it does. And the reason that it does is because of communist ideology. It's Marxism-Leninism. It's a variety of Marxism-Leninism with Chinese characteristics. And it is really the core issue. And yet, based on the really strong cultural aversion to anti-communism stemming from the McCarthy period in the 1950s, there's what I call anti-communist culture within government and society as a whole. And we need to overcome that and really understand the nature. A famous example was the article of George Kennan wrote, the famous Mr. X article in Foreign Affairs about it was called the sources of Soviet conduct. And what he identified as the sources of Soviet conduct was Marxism-Leninism. We need to do a similar assessment of China. It's beginning to be realized, but the sources of Chinese conduct, why is China expanding around the world, stem from its Marxist-Leninist ideology. I can tell you I've been in public debates with China experts who have insisted to me that China is no longer communist, and to which I say, please go visit the People's Liberation Army Museum in Beijing, which I did. If you go in that museum, you will see 30-foot statues of the founding fathers of communism, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Mao Zedong, Stalin. They're still there. And so the Chinese regime sees itself as locked in a death struggle with world capitalism led by the United States. This was one of the central messages of my book, Deceiving the Sky. And so if you don't understand that, then you just look at China as just simply another nation like France or Germany or the United States or like that. It's not. It's a communist system motivated by communist ideology. Now let's look at their ports facilities. Right now, China has established 95 port facilities that are run by state-owned companies. And the key to understanding this is that China is not like the United States. It has what is known as military civilian fusion. So everything that China does civilian-wise has an element of the military. They don't distinguish. The factories here in the United States, the factories that make refrigerators don't make missiles. In China, the factories that make refrigerators make missiles. They make space launchers and they make ICBMs, and so there's no distinction. They've dropped that distinction. We need to understand that clearly. The other thing I would emphasize, and this was in the piece that Michael mentioned about the containerized missile threat. China is developing what is known as a container missile. That is, it's a YJ-18 long-range cruise missile. And what makes this missile unique is it's modeled after the Russian Club K, which is a containerized cruise missile. It's put in a 40-foot shipping container. Of course, all of these ports have thousands and hundreds of thousands of these containers. What it means to have a containerized missile is that these port facilities, which again are ostensibly civilian in nature, can actually be turned into cruise missile bases. And I quoted in that piece a civilian US official who said that if there is a war with China, the opening segment will begin with China using these containerized missiles to take out key nodes of communication and other strikes. So this is a real threat, and it's something that needs to be looked at very carefully. I'll stop there, and hopefully I've triggered enough for some questions, and we can go forward in the question period for any elaboration that you like.
Oh, thank you, Bill. This is just great. Everybody's being so clear and concise that we're going to have a really good discussion. Our next speaker is Mr. James E. Fannell, former Director of Intelligence and Information Operations for the Pacific Fleet. He actually retired from that post in 2015 with 30 years of a distinguished career. He also emphasized in his intelligence work the Chinese Navy and its operations. His most recent assignment was the Director of Intelligence and Information for the Pacific Fleet. So throughout his career, he served in a variety of afloat and ashore assignments across the Pacific region, highlighted by tours with the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, the U.S. 7th Fleet, and also working with every level of intelligence. He was a National Security Affairs Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and he studied Chinese, national political, and security affairs. He holds a BA in History and Political Science and a MA in History in the University of Hawaii, also MA from the Air Command and Staff College, MA in Military Science. James is a public speaker and well-known throughout the intelligence and military world. We welcome you, Mr. James Fannell. Welcome.
Dr. Jenkins, thank you for the invitation. I thank the Universal Peace Foundation and Washington Times Foundation for the kind invitation and the honor to speak with these two previous expert speakers. And it's a hard act to follow given some of the things that they've said. I think I'll start off with just touching up a bit on what Bill mentioned about the intelligence community where I worked for my entire career, and how there was this institutionalized resistance to warning about China. I came back from my first assignment on board the USS Kitty Hawk in Japan in 2005, and I came back to the Pentagon. I briefed some senior officers there and warned them that China was getting ready and preparing to reunify or take Taiwan, as they call it, reunify. It's not really a reunification because they've never had it before, but the People's Republic of China had designs and they were preparing for this. And I was told by some senior officers that if they were naval senior officers, that if they went across and told their Army or Air Force or Marine Corps counterparts that they'd get laughed out of the Pentagon. And so we spent 30 years, last year was the 30th anniversary of Desert Storm. And we spent the last 30 years as a nation focused on the Middle East and the war on terror. And we can debate that. But from my perspective of having been on the other side of the world, we neglected the rise of China. And it's not a peaceful rise, as they say. In 2013, 2014, I gave a couple of speeches in San Diego at the U.S. Naval Institute. And I talked about China's short, sharp war that they would use to take the Senkakus from Japan in conjunction with the Taiwan invasion. And that was ridiculed by many of the think tanks in Washington, D.C. In 2015, I wrote a paper that talked about the Chinese would have a 500-ship Navy in 2030, and that was criticized. In 2019, I was speaking again up at the Newport at the Naval War College and talked about the notion that China had global naval aspirations and that they were seeking maritime superiority by 2049 and or earlier. And that was, again, resistance there to this idea. So we've had 30 years of kind of an institutionalized resistance to this for most of the reasons that Bill outlined. And so that's been a little bit part of my frustration. But as an intelligence professional, my job is to continue to predict and call out warning into the future. And so what I've been trying to get across to people now is I think more and more people are recognizing that there is an inherent existential threat from the People's Republic of China and what it means to peace in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia and globally. But what we haven't really accepted is this idea that the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party are on a timeline. And we kind of also bifurcate leaders, paramount leaders. We look at Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi, and we kind of, it's popular in Washington today to say that Xi is an outlier, and that if we could just get rid of Xi, that things would be better, and we could go back to what I call the Kissinger School of Engagement, where we could just engage with China, talk with them, and everything would work out. And I'm here to submit that there has been no fundamental change in the outlook of the paramount leaders amongst the Chinese Communist Party, that they've just become more refined, and that now that Xi has power, both economically and militarily and diplomatically, that they're able to be much more aggressive than they had under Deng with his hide and bide strategy. And so what we see now is Xi has opened up his time as the leader, the great leader, he calls himself the helmsman of China, with the One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative that's expanded China's economic power around the globe. 2017, the Xinhua News reported that China actually, in addition to the Belt and Road, had 3 blue economic corridors. One would go through that South China Sea that Guy described, into the Indian Ocean and into the Mediterranean. Another one would go up through the Bering Sea and into the Arctic. And then the third economic corridor would go out into the South Pacific. And that's what we're seeing happen over these last 5 years since they told us that. And they'd been developing that plan through their comprehensive national power for years before that. So the issue now before us is, what is China's design? And their design is for what Xi has described as the great rejuvenation of China, the great rejuvenation of the People's Republic of China, which is to restore, is to place China back in this position that they believe they deserve, which is to be the arbiter of all global decisions and economics and everything. The word you've probably heard Gordon Chang talk about, Qin Sha, all under heaven, so that they are the rulers of the universe, if you will. In the 1860s, in the Ming and Qing dynasties, the known universe that mattered for them at that time was in Asia, was around China, and the satellite nations that kowtowed to them. In 2022, the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party recognize that the world is a global world, and that they're going to have to influence and control those global institutions, which is why you have the Belt and Road Initiative, why you have trains traveling from central China into Europe with goods, why you have the United Nations dominated by Chinese diplomats in positions of key authority, like we've seen the last 2 years in the World Health Organization. But the other part of it is territorial acquisition. And while China has, the Communist Party's design is to acquire all these things without firing a shot, like they did at Scarborough Shoal in 2012, where they seized Scarborough Shoal from the Republic of the Philippines, a US ally, treaty ally, defense ally. They took that territory from Taiwan without firing a shot. They built those 7 artificial islands, 3 of which are the size of Pearl Harbor. You don't hear that reported, that China built 3 Pearl Harbors in the South China Sea. They did all that without firing a shot, and they essentially acquired control of the South China Sea. Not absolute control, but they are there all the time. So when the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Carl Vinson that are operating there right now depart in a week and they go back home to the West Coast, the Chinese will still be there in force with those 3 major airfields and naval bases in the Spratlys. They'll be there with tens and tens of ships that are operating daily in the South China Sea. So then the last area that's really in dispute from their perspective, they've got control of Hong Kong now. They're pushing on India, which is another area that we could talk about. But the last big piece, and the one that's really most important to them, is Taiwan. And they're on a trajectory to take Taiwan, and it's not going to be in 100 years. They're on a timeline to take it so that by 2049, whoever is the leader of China, the People's Republic of China in 2049, on 1 October for their National Day, is going to stand up in front of the Forbidden City and say, we have been restored. We have completed the great rejuvenation that Comrade Xi told us about in 2022, and the great China dream has been achieved. And to do that, they're going to have to bring Taiwan to heel. and they prefer to not use military force, but they're prepared to use it. And so the question is, when are they going to use it? And I have, for the last 10 years, been saying that this decade,
We can't hear
2020,
anything.
Go ahead.
2020 to 2030, are the most dangerous decade. We know that Hu Jintao and Xi ordered the PLA to be ready to take Taiwan in 2020 militarily. And in 2030 is probably the end time that they could use military force and expect the world to come back and go to a ceremony in Beijing in 2049. And so this 10-year period is very tenuous. And now we have the commander of U.S. Pacific Command, the outgoing one, Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Davidson, last March say he thought it would be around 2027. Last October, the Minister of Defense from Taiwan said he thought it would be 2025, which is a remarkable statement from any Taiwan government official from either party. And so, and you have people now talking about, even Congressman McCall saying that it could come as early as right after the Beijing Olympics. And we are seeing, not just in diplomacy and rhetoric from the Chinese, we're also seeing it in their military operations. Just in the last couple of days, they've penetrated the Taiwan Air Defense Identification Zone with high numbers of fighter and bomber aircraft. Their naval patrols with carriers and ships are circumnavigating Taiwan. And so they've increased the pressure on Taiwan, and they're getting ready to do something, and we're not prepared for it. And that's my greatest concern. And then lastly, I think the last key element that I think has really changed in the last 6 to 8 months is the fact that for my career, when we talked about the PRC and the PLA, it was always in conventional terms. But in the last 6, 8 months, we've seen now commercial imagery that has shown 350 intercontinental ballistic missile silos being built out in central and western China. And so what I'm afraid of is that in 2012, Dr. Phil Carver gave a warning about the underground Great Wall, where he and his undergraduate and graduate students did an analysis that said there were thousands of kilometers of tunnels in China that were being developed to house ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. And now here we are 10 years later, and we're seeing China in 1 year build 350 silos. And they're seeking, I think, to have nuclear superiority over America. And no one in America's defense establishment is really talking about it. It's been reported, but it's not really driving the agenda. In my mind, this should be probably the #1 topic in American defense circles. And I think I'll close there.
Welcome back, everyone. Well, I hope you learned something from that video, and if you'd like to speak a little bit more in depth on this and learn a little bit more about our programs at Universal Peace Federation and what we're trying to do to promote these values of interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values, then please get in touch with me. And as always, I'd like to promote the biographies of our founder, Dr. Reverend Sun Myung Moon, and his wife, Dr. Hak Jahan Moon. They're complimentary. If you're interested, please get in touch with me. So thank you for joining us today.